In this video, we're going to be talking about Photoshop and Gimp. Making a comparison of these two software apps that are used in a whole range of creative and technical disciplines. The apps are two of the oldest in this field. They can be used in such fields as photography, and photo editing is probably what these packages are best known for. They can also be used for making complex photo manipulations and photo compositions. They're used in education, in marketing, in architecture, in all sorts of design, graphic design. They can be used to create original art. Now, these apps are both two of the oldest that people still use, and they're very different and also very similar. What I want to do with this video is to compare them, and I think we can probably start off with a general introduction. Let us start off with Photoshop. So Photoshop is available as part of the Creative Cloud apps, and you can get that for $54 a month, and that includes about 50 pieces of software. You can get it, there's a special discount today, which is $40 a month. I think that's for the entire year. However, you can also get it as a $20 app. There's also another, this is the $20 app. I think you get about 1 terabytes worth of storage on that one. And this one is a 20 gigabytes worth of storage. Two apps are shown here. Let's take a closer look and see what you actually get with the photography plan, which is at $10 a month. I think is pretty good. So we've got these two options. One is for photography, 20 gigabytes and $10. Photography, 1 terabyte, $20. And Lightroom, 1 terabyte, $10. So you've got a bunch of options. And what we'll do is to take a look at the least expensive one, which is the photography plan. And hopefully, now you can get free trials on all of these. The trials don't last that long, but I'll give you an idea of what kind of software you're getting. It's about 1 or 2 gigabytes download. Let's take a look at exactly what they're offering. Now, the subscription for this plan includes 5 apps. We've got Photoshop, Photoshop Lightroom, Photoshop Express, and Photoshop Lightroom Classic. Now, these apps, I say 5 because Photoshop is actually 2 apps, one which is for the iPad, one for the desktop. The iPad version is so distinct and has such a different learning curve that I prefer to refer to it as a separate package. Photoshop Lightroom is the one which is most flexible. It can be used on any device, phones, tablets. I think it's actually the iPad, and I think it's the iPhone. You can also use it on desktops. Photoshop Express is kind of, they say it's edit, collage, and retouch photos on the go. It's very simple, straightforward. Photoshop Lightroom Classic is the one which is used for traditional photo editing. It's the one used by the photographers who are running a business, who are professional photographers. So you're getting 3-4 excellent apps which you can use for photography and for design. Lightroom, start off with Lightroom. Lightroom is the software app which is used for mobile editing of photographs. It's a new one. It's just called Lightroom, but it's not the same package as we used to call Lightroom 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. With this one, you can do editing. It has a very simple slider interface that allows you to edit things quickly on your iPad or your iPhone. It's powerful like the classic Lightroom. However, it is cloud first. That means your images are going to get saved onto the cloud. It's not really designed for desktop use, and some people prefer working like this. They prefer working with an app on their iPad on the move, getting everything done without actually moving into the desktop environment. It doesn't save anything on the desktop. Everything is backed up to the cloud. So it's for the mobile person, and obviously someone who is using the desktop version can use this version as well. Yes! So with all these apps, you get updates for the entire year. that you're subscribed to it. Lightroom Classic is the one for the professional photographers. It's a more creative control. It allows you, if you've got terabytes of data on your hard drive or your SSD, this is the one you're going to be using. Things are stored locally. They're not managed on the cloud. It doesn't do that. It doesn't back up to the cloud. You got to take care of your own materials. As they say here, it's desktop only. The other one is desktop, mobile, and web. Lightroom Classic is the one that we used to call Lightroom just a few years ago. They've changed it to Lightroom Classic because the emphasis now is really on Lightroom being a mobile piece of software. Saves to the local hard drive, recommended for experts. It's the one that if you've done Lightroom in the past, it's the one you probably know and love. We move on to the Photoshop for the iPad. This one is a relatively new one. It just came out in the last couple of years. There have been some major updates to this one, so you can actually use artificial intelligence. We're going to be looking at some of the artificial intelligence features that you can use on the iPad. It's been added in the last couple of weeks. There was an amazing article on Imaging Resource which explained all the updates. Content Aware Fill, which is a really useful feature in Photoshop. The ability to use AI to make selections and to edit your work, that's all been added to the iPad version. This is something that's going to, I think, completely change how people relate to the iPad version. I think initially when the iPad version came out, it wasn't that popular. People found it hard. It's a different learning curve. But with the new features, I think a lot of people who might not have decided to experiment with it will be trying it out and seeing what it's like.
Yes.
So this is actually an image which was created. This is from Behance. It was created by this artist here. And this was created on the tool that they used to create this was the iPad, Photoshop on iPad. So you can use it on any iPad. And I think as we get to that confluence of iPads and computers where the iPads are becoming very, very powerful, you can use them for editing. In the past, people might have used the iPad as a kind of a gallery or as a monitor. You can now use it to edit your photographs and to create complex designs. And that shift, I think, is something that is probably going to accelerate with some of the new features that we've seen added to the iPad version of Photoshop. Like I say, even older versions of the iPad, you don't have to have just an iPad Pro. You can use it on older versions of the iPad, the M1 iPad, and the Intel iPads. Or is it ARM iPads? Or the older ones, you can use it on those as well. And moving on to a piece of software called Photoshop. Now, as you can see, there is this bargain here for, that's for the entire Creative Cloud. They have these offers from time to time. Pretty good, some of them. If you're a student, you should check out the links in the description. You'll be able to get a significant discount, I think, for teachers as well. Now, when we talk of Photoshop, we're talking about a software app that many people have heard of as a software app for basic photo editing, for retouching, but also for manipulating images and creating all kinds of new and crazy juxtapositions. So not only can it edit photographs, but it can also do vector. So it's got some of the features that you find in Illustrator, and those are getting more and more sophisticated as time goes by. So you can create things using fonts as well from the Adobe font, from the Adobe Creative Cloud, thousands of fonts. It's powerful. We'll take a look at some of the things that it can do a little bit later. And one thing that applies both for Photoshop and Gimp, we are on the Adobe Exchange. There are lots of extensions here, and these extensions can be small plugins, they can be major plugins. The ones for Photoshop, some of those are free, some of those are paid, some of those are not very well known, some of those are like Motion Array, very well known brand. You can use a lot of different plugins inside of Photoshop. Now, my own approach is I try to use as few plugins as possible. Much as I would like to use them, I tend to find the plugins, they tend to make things sometimes a little bit less stable. I tend to find crashes. But anyway, that's just me. You've got one problem that I find with Photoshop, which is that certain features that are built in to Gimp, For instance, the ability to open up WebP. I don't think we can see it here, but this is a plugin for WebM. You can do video editing inside of Photoshop. WebM is one of the movie formats you can edit inside of Photoshop. I don't think this is actually a Photoshop plugin, but if you wanted to open up a WebP format, you'd have to get a plugin for that. In Gimp, I can just open up a WebP file format. It's built in. There's a lot of stuff inside of Gimp which is built in that I don't need plugins for. I think it helps to make that software much more stable. Instead of having a bunch of different plugins everywhere, makes it easier when you update as well. So Photoshop, I like the plugins, but I prefer not to install them. And I would prefer if Photoshop actually had more built-in features for things that I use on a regular basis. And finally, we have something called Photoshop Express. This is a mobile app. It can be used to create beautiful effects inside of photographs. You can see the little composition here, the girl, the balloon. It's all coming together nicely. I don't use this software. I think it's a bit simple, but if you haven't got huge time, or you just want to use something which is kind of cool and trendy, I suppose you could do this for for Instagram or whatever. I think it comes with I think you can probably get it free, to be honest with you. It's not very impressive, but it comes as part of this app, this package, this bundle. Yes. So I'm gonna move on to Gimp now, and this is a selection of designs that have been tagged on Behance as using Gimp as part of the process. Now you can probably tell just from looking at these that the artists probably have used Gimp as part of a larger process. So this is how designers and artists use Gimp as part of a workflow that involves Gimp at some point. You can see the range of things that Gimp can be used for. It's vast. The software has been around for 25 years and it can be used for so many different things that it's difficult to summarize what you can actually do with it. I found some images here which are images which are using Gimp, and these are caricatures. You can see these are digital drawings, and you can find images like this made by Gimp for more than a decade, going back to 2 decades. It's very powerful, and how you use it depends really on how much time you are willing to devote to learning it. We're here on the web page for Gimp, the gimp.org. As you can see, the current version is 2.10.30, and 2.10 came out in around 2018. There have been 15 iterations. It's used for high quality photo manipulation, as they say here, original artwork, programming algorithms, something that I don't get involved with at all. And but you can find quite a lot of plugins online for Gimp. Some of those are very useful. Graphic design elements, and desktop publishing. And they mentioned something also about the extensibility and flexibility of the software. This is really a key thing. Gimp has got tons of plugins, and in the past the plugins were really, and even now I find the plugins for Gimp really an essential part of the software. So the ability to use it as a platform is just as important as to be able to use the software natively. So we're actually now inside of the software. This is 2.10.22. I use a slightly older version than the current version, but and I've got my own reasons for that. But as you can see, the interface, we've got some tools that we use for this area here, the canvas. We've got some layers, which are basically one of the iconic features of this type of software. You can add different layers on top of one another and composite using the layer stack. The tools are used to manipulate the image directly. We've also got colors, the color menu, which we use to adjust the image in whatever way we want. We can make it darker, lighter, change the exposure, change the colors. There's an insane amount of things that we can do. The filters dialog is key. This is what really differentiates this type of software. You can see we can do powerful manipulations. I'm creating a kind of bokeh effect using this one filter here. It's a fairly recent one, and it's a beautiful effect. Very easy to use. And this is the kind of thing, if I had been using this 10 years ago, just one of these renders would take about 5 minutes to do inside of Gimp. It's improved a lot over time. Let's talk about performance. Now, I recently did a video where we looked at the performance of Gimp and Photoshop. So it's one thing to get an opinion about how software works. It's another thing to get hard data. This is kind of like evidence about how Lightroom, in this case, uses the GPU and the CPU. And you can see the GPU is very well utilized inside of Lightroom. And what I found with this was that even entry-level graphics card can be used with Lightroom to greatly enhance the experience and the performance of the software. And that's important because sometimes with photographers, maybe you're dealing with hundreds or even thousands of images that you need to process fairly quickly. Lightroom fully utilizes whatever hardware you've got to get the best results. Inside of Photoshop, we can see that Photoshop uses the CPU and the GPU to get maximum performance as well. This ability to utilize all the features that all the hardware that you've got, that's an important one for performance. And I think with Photoshop, it gets it perfect. When I was making this video, I had about 5 or 6 images open inside of Photoshop. Photoshop was using 4 gigabytes of my RAM. After about half an hour, it dropped to 300 megabytes. I don't know how it did it, but I didn't need to close any images for it to reduce the amount of RAM it was using. It's very efficient, and even if you haven't got a very powerful system, Photoshop will make excellent use of that. It does install in a couple of gigabytes. It takes about a couple of gigabytes of storage. It has an irritating habit of just updating in the middle of no time when you least want it to update. But otherwise, it makes excellent use of whatever hardware you've got. And here we are, same video. We're looking at Gimp now, and Gimp is making mainly use of the CPU. It doesn't have GPU acceleration. So all the GPU usage you're seeing is probably the screen recording software. Gimp is not using hardware acceleration. It's not using the GPU. It does make a lot of use of the RAM, any RAM I've got. In fact, I try to get as much RAM as I can, especially for Gimp. But the CPU is mainly where Gimp is at. And if you don't have a very powerful CPU, it can get a bit slow and sluggish. So overall, in terms of performance, Photoshop, Lightroom, they win very easily. Gimp improves over time, and certain features that were very painful to use are now much faster, but I would like to have a much faster computer to be able to fully utilize Gimp. Inside of Gimp itself, the user interface gets blasted quite a lot, and it's easy to understand why. This is the first video that I'm making on a 4K monitor, and if you just take a look around, you can see some features that are very small, some icons that are extremely small to see. Some of these icons here, very hard to read what's going on. And the problem there is not that the developers don't care about this. The developers are using very old code, and that code just will not update to a point where we can actually see good sized icons. On a 1080 screen, it's not a problem. On a 4K monitor, high DPI, this is not a particularly high DPI monitor, but I struggle sometimes to see exactly what the icons are actually showing. On a 1080 monitor, not a problem. 4K monitors, you're gonna have some issues, especially if you're trying to learn the software. And the user interface can be modified. This user interface is not the standard one. I have a customized user interface which uses a specific theme, changes the fonts, changes the way things look. And I like it like that. I like to be able to customize the software. Now, the biggest advantage of Gimp is not just the customization. It is the fact that you can install it on as many computers as you want. There is no cost. You download it free. You install it on as many computers as you want. And there is no cost up front. And there's the only thing they ask for is donations. It's led by volunteers. It's not a team of 40 people working on the software. It's a small team of volunteers who maintain the software and update it. So the fact that it's free to use is a big attraction. But the other point I was making, that the hardware that I need to use Gimp is much more powerful than the hardware that I need to use Photoshop, especially if I'm working with large images. The other issue is sometimes with GIMP, when I'm editing in GIMP, it can, although it's got a lot of the same tools as Photoshop, and some of those tools are pretty cool. You know, we can work with this sort of 3D tool that allows us to spin things around and flip them around. There's nothing quite like this inside of Photoshop. One that I like, I'll demonstrate it on this image here, is the handle tool. We click once, we move the image. This is a very large image. We click a second time, we can rotate and resize the image at the same time. A third time allows us to get this kind of squeezy effect, and we can change the angles. A fourth click allows us to change the perspective. So it's got a lot of very unusual and unique tools, and that's one of the things I like about the software. But typically speaking, I think GIMP is not quite as smart as Photoshop in terms of the features that it has. Some of the tools just work really, really poorly. This tool, for instance, is supposed to allow me, let me demonstrate it on a different image. I want to move this shark around. I'm supposed to be able to make a cage around the shark like that. And then I'm supposed to be able to move the shark around. And the thing is, I can, but you get this delay and it's very difficult to use it. But it's a nice idea. It's just not practical on large size images. If you're working on a 1080 by 1920 by 1080 image, it's not a problem. If you're working on a YouTube thumbnail, this is not a problem. But once you get to about 30 megabytes of image size, it can be problematic in terms of performance. One thing that is very good about GIMP is the way the filters work. So let's say I wanted to enhance this with a high pass filter. We come over here and the filter produces this gray nonsense. We can change the blend mode, go to soft light, and we can increase the contrast. You can see we can play around with the image like so. Now, if I was to use this filter inside of Photoshop, there's an identical one. I wouldn't be able to see this before I finished actually applying it. I wouldn't be able to see it on the entire image like this before I hit the OK button. Inside of GIMP, I can play around with it, see exactly what I'm going to get, and make any adjustments that I want before I hit the OK button. I think all in all, for very quick edits, GIMP has got a nice workflow, but you've got to know which tools work well. Some of the filters will take a long time to render. That's usually not the case with Photoshop. And I think if you can get used to the slower filters, the ones that are not so good, and learn to avoid them for your computer, it's a much smoother experience. Here we are inside of Photoshop. You can tell these look very similar on the surface. There is one really important feature inside of Photoshop which is missing in GIMP, which is if we go to the Windows workspace area, we can change the workspace. So this is the workspace for photography. We've got another workspace for graphic design and web. We've got another these workspaces can be modified. They can be saved. With GIMP, we can't really save different profiles. We can't save different workspaces. That's an issue with GIMP. There are workarounds, but none of them are really perfect. There's a 3D workspace, and unfortunately the 3D menu, which used to be really cool, is no longer, it's been deprecated. So Photoshop no longer really has a good 3D menu. You can't really do cool 3D inside of Photoshop anymore. Let's demonstrate some of the differences with GIMP in terms of performance and workflow. I'm going to make a selection around this shark and to change its position. We'll go to the object selection tool. Now this is one of the AI tools inside of Photoshop, and we can draw, we've got it in rectangle mode. We're going to draw a rectangle around the shark, and it should select the shark. We've now got a shark selection. Hitting Control or Command J puts the shark on its own layer, and we can now use, let's say, the puppet warp command, and we can use the puppet warp command to simply change the shape of the shark so that it now looks a little bit more like a dolphin. We'll commit that, And we've got our shark sort of curving. Very simple to do, much easier to do this type of thing inside of Photoshop than inside of Gimp. And generally speaking, that is the way I think Photoshop tends to be the software to use if you're doing complex designs. Sometimes Gimp can be very quick and easy to use, but when things get really complicated, Photoshop gives you the leverage you need to get things done. Another area where there's a key difference with Photoshop is in the ability to play around in the layers dialog, so we can go ahead and create specific types of layers. One, for instance, would be the color balance, and this layer will sit in the layers on the layers panel, as they call it in Photoshop, and it allows us to change the colors. Now, what's important about this is that it allows us to go back if we don't like a particular edit. In this image here, we've got a guy falling out of the sky, and you might think to yourself, okay, the AI has never seen anything like this, so it won't be able to make a selection of the guy. But the artificial intelligence makes a reasonably good selection. As you can see there, it's got most of the guy selected. If we use this new tool and just draw a rectangle around the guy, our Superman, it's an even better selection. So you can see that the artificial intelligence, it wasn't anywhere near this good when it first started, but it has improved over time. Another factor which is in Photoshop's favor is the ability to make very complex selections. So with this girl here, she's got this frizzy coat going on and it's looking all nice and furry. If we try to make a selection around her, what we find is that the software, the artificial intelligence, actually manages to go in and it really finds areas, that kind of frizziness going on. It really goes in there and does a very refined job of finding the position where the foreground transitions into the background. It's very intelligent. This is the kind of thing that we would have been able to do much more effectively inside of Gimp just a few years ago, before this kind of artificial intelligence began to appear inside of Photoshop. In this photograph, I'm going to demonstrate again this ability to create layers where we can change fundamentally how an object appears. And this can be done with not just one layer, we can create several layers. Color balance, and you can stack layers on top of layers and actually get very complex edits done. And the thing is, you can go back to the previous layer and say, I want to work with different colors. It's very flexible, and sometimes when you're doing anything artistic, you gotta have that sort of flexibility. Another area where Photoshop outshines is in its color management. So if we go to mode, we've got CMYK, we've got lab color, multi-channel, we've got 16 bits, 32 bits. Now, these are really more important for professionals rather than casual users. Lab color, multi-channel, CMYK, very important, particularly CMYK for doing print work. So very high quality, maybe very expensive print runs. Inside of Photoshop, you can change the color mode. Now, what you find sometimes is that the effects that you apply in one mode don't actually carry over to another mode. Inside of Photoshop, we can also create filters, and these filters, like for instance the blur gallery, let's go and apply an iris blur, and the iris blur allows us to create a focal point and a little bit of bokeh going on, a little bit of bokeh, whatever they call that. And this allows us to create an effect which we can actually edit again as long as we choose the convert for smart filters, and this will make re-editable smart filters where we can change the parameters whenever we want. That ability doesn't exist inside of Gimp. However, when we apply the filters inside of Gimp, we can apply them in pretty much any mode. So we can apply them in 16 8-bit, 16 32-bit mode, and some effects you have inside of Gimp. I was able to do a transition effect where we were transitioning between two scenes, and that needed 32-bit mode, but it needed me to apply a filter in 32-bit mode. And inside of Photoshop, sometimes when you work in 32-bit mode, you cannot access some of these filters. Same goes for 16-bit mode. So there's some limitations with Photoshop that sometimes, really I would go and work inside of Gimp if I can't do something inside of Photoshop. There is also a bunch of new artificial intelligence filters called the neural filters. And I have a mixed relationship with these. We could go to style transfer, turn that on, and we could try to apply an effect. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So it's processing. It's worked this time. So with these filters, I have a mixed relationship with them. Sometimes they produce really nice effects. You can control the effects using these sliders here. It's using artificial intelligence to create artistic-like portraits. And like I say, sometimes it works well, sometimes not so well. But it's nice exploring some of these features. I would say that these are fairly new, and I would say that they're improving. There are some very interesting ones, like portrait generator. We've got long water long exposure, shadow generator. This seems very interesting. What the heck is going on there? And we've got noise reduction. I've been waiting for this one for a long time, but we haven't seen anything like this come through yet. Let me cancel out. Now, there are other artificial intelligence features inside of Photoshop that really are kind of really useful. Some of them have been there for more than a decade, and maybe in a different video we'll talk a little bit about those. So back inside of Gimp, we've got some color management features. These are nowhere near as comprehensive as the color management features inside of Photoshop. We've also got the precision menu. This allows us to convert 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, 16-bit floating point, 32-bit floating point, and perceptual gamma or linear light. Now, I said that the Photoshop and Gimp are both used in creative as well as technical fields. And you can see there maybe that Gimp is in some ways a little bit more sophisticated when it comes to some of these technical edits, like working in 32-bit floating point, linear light, perceptual gamma. It does have the ability to work in RGB mode. And we also have the ability to do CMYK proofs. So we can go into color management, and there's a proof colors option for CMYK proofing, but we don't have CMYK mode. Now, there are some interesting features that allow you to kind of play around with CMYK, but nothing anywhere near as sophisticated as what we have inside of Photoshop. Here inside of Photoshop, if we go to the Edit Color Settings menu, you will see something like you've never seen before. We've got these color profiles, all of them built into Photoshop. We've got Apple RGB, we've got Pro Photo, we've got Image P3. Inside of Photoshop, when we do change the profiles, say we assign a different color, we actually get to see the changes immediately. And there we are. So that's something which inside of Gimp, you can't do that. You can't see this kind of immediate change to what your image is going to look like. And sometimes you want that. You want to be able to compare before and after. And really, there are a lot of features like that where Photoshop is just more suited for professional work than Gimp. But obviously, as you can see, both software apps have got a lot of potential, a lot of capability. And if your demands are not really massive, you can use either one for quite a lot of work. If we go to the filters menu, there's a camera raw filter, and so we can actually edit using features that we find in Lightroom. So it's very similar to Lightroom, but it's here as an option inside of Photoshop. So you can use it as a filter, and you can also use it as a smart filter. So you can go back and change the settings and the parameters anytime you want. So that ability to work inside of Camera Raw, that is a really useful filter, and it's more useful for me than any filter that Gimp has. Although Gimp has got some really, really useful filters. If you see some of the videos on this channel, you'll see some of those in action. Now, a word about the AI that Adobe is creating. Adobe has not just lucked out in creating pretty awesome artificial intelligence. They actually have an entire business segment devoted to artificial intelligence. You can see some of it here. This is the creative stuff. making a car disappear. Amazing. Just disappears out of the video. But it's not just creatives. They use that in marketing, data analysis. This is a fully fledged artificial intelligence business segment that they're running there. Gimp is available on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Photoshop is available on Windows and Mac OS. When you use the format, the XCF format, you can save your layers and you can save any areas of transparency as well. The XCF format is open source as well, so you can access your files anytime. With Photoshop, you do have to have a live account on Adobe. In order to be able to access your files, you've got to have an active account, paid account. The file format is the PSD format. We can open some PSD files inside of Gimp, but typically you're going to have the Photoshop account functioning, fully paid up to be able to access your work. Now, if you want to access Gimp, I'll have a link in the description to where you can download it. Photoshop, you can download it. Again, I'll have links in the description to the different price plans.